If I had stayed silent, my family would still be using my name for their benefit. They praised my sister and pushed her into the spotlight while quietly removing me from photos, records, and decisions. I didn't argue or confront them. I paid attention, saved proof, and waited, because the day I asked why I was treated differently, I realized I had already planned how my story was supposed to end. But the moment I followed the paper trail, everything they built began to collapse. Before I tell you how that realization unfolded, do me a small favor. Follow this story and drop a comment about where you're listening from. It helps these stories reach people who need them more than they realize. My name is Alara Vaughn, and people in Briarhaven love a good story, especially the kind that stays neat. They talk about bake sales and engagement rings, and who sits closest to the aisle at St. Alden's Chapel. When they talk about the Vaughns, voices soften like respect requires a whisper. God-fearing, polished, reliable. No one ever asks what it costs to keep an image that clean. The first crack showed on a Sunday in early October. The magnolias outside the house filtered sunlight like stained glass, and the kitchen smelled of roast chicken and honeyed carrots. Marion Vaughn, my mother, moved through the dining room placing plates, accepting praise, directing attention. My sister, Serafina, drifted behind her in silk and smiles, collecting admiration without effort. The walls were lined with frames, pageant ribbons, charity galas, Easter whites on church steps. Then someone stopped in front of the newest frame. It was perfect, bright, professional. Marion centered like a queen, Serafina glowing beside her in lace. Everyone admired it. I stared too long. I must have blinked, I said lightly, because humor sometimes feels safer than truth. Marion didn't miss a beat. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, smooth as icing. "You were standing behind the post. The photographer couldn't get a clean angle. Next time, stand a little taller." She smiled as if she'd offered a helpful tip instead of erasing me. Serafina laughed into her napkin. "She always fades into the background," she said, and the table laughed with her. I didn't. That night, after the guests left and the house settled into its heavy quiet, I opened the side cabinet where Marion kept the family albums. Christmases, 4th of July picnics, Serafina's first solo at chapel. Page after page, I appeared the same way, half in, half gone. A shoulder here, a shadow there. Once, a frame slid over half my face. I took photos of each page with my phone and slid everything back exactly where it had been. That was the night I stopped wondering and started documenting. A week later, St. Alden's honored Serafina as a young woman of purpose. Candles were lit. Marion beamed. I sat in the last pew near the humming fan. A woman leaned toward Marion and whispered, "Is this your only daughter?" Marion smiled. "Yes. She's our pride." I didn't flinch. If a record goes uncorrected, does it become truth? There had been signs for years, school newsletters that listed only one Vaughn, PDA thank you cards addressed to Serafina alone, a teacher who asked if I was the helper girl when I dropped off my sister's homework. I told myself I was imagining it, until one afternoon I overheard Marion on the porch with a church friend, her voice drifting through a cracked window. "Only one worth the frame," she said softly. "The rest, you know how it is." Confirmation lands colder than surprise. I started journaling then, not feelings, facts. Dates, omissions, screenshots. Because when someone edits you out politely, you need a ledger to prove you were there. The day before Thanksgiving, Marion clipped Christmas cards to fairy lights in the hall. I found the one I'd made last year. Hand-cut snowflakes, names written in gold. Only 2 names showed. Mine had been folded under. I folded it tighter and walked away. Sometimes fire doesn't start with a match. It begins with the silence after your name is forgotten. Late that night, the house breathed its old secrets. I lay awake and heard Marion's voice through the vent, soft and certain. "Only one needs to be remembered," she murmured. "The rest aren't real." I stared at the ceiling until morning refused to come. At breakfast, she asked if I'd slept well, eyes on her tea. "Dreams reveal who we are," she said. "I never forget mine." I smiled because smiling was safer than asking what kind of dreams require erasing a child. A week later, I helped at Magnolia Row Florals while Marion tapped on her laptop in the office. The printer whirred and spit out a page with my name at the top. Insurance. Insured, Elara Vaughn. Beneficiary, Marion Vaughn. Policy date, my last birthday. I folded the paper and put it back. She hadn't baked me a cake that year. Said she was watching sugar. After closing, I unlocked her desk drawer. Old policies. One cancelled for Serafina years ago. Mine active. Recently updated. A note paper-clipped to it in Marion's handwriting. If something happens, move quick. I went home and brushed my hair in the mirror and asked myself what they'd call it if I vanished. A mishap. A tragic oversight. A paragraph in a church bulletin with my name spelled right for once. The gas incident came next. Late evening. The stove knob half-turned. Windows shut, the alarm unplugged. I twisted it off and called Marion from the landline. "Were you cooking earlier?" I asked. "No," she said too quickly. "Must have been Serafina." "Why?" "Nothing burned," I said. "Not yet." Later, Serafina wrinkled her nose. "Why does it smell weird?" I told her old houses hold things. She shrugged and went upstairs. I slept lightly after that. Left notes about safety where they'd be seen. Marion read them, smiled, poured my coffee black just the way I liked it. I stopped trusting warmth that arrived without explanation. At the Alden Fellowship Center fundraiser, Serafina arrived late in pink silk and applause found her anyway. Marion announced her like a future written in ink. When the scholarship was awarded to Serafina, the room rose as one. I clapped because ghosts clap. My chest remembered another video from years before. My father, Thomas Vaughn, tired but kind. In the version Marion played, he named Serafina, and the screen went dark. No mention of me. When I asked, Marion said he must have forgotten. 3 days later, reorganizing the pantry Marion never touched, I found a flash drive behind expired vitamins, labeled in my father's hand. I waited until midnight. At 6 minutes and 14 seconds, he paused and said, "Make sure Elara knows she'll always have a home. Not just the house, my name. She's part of it." That line was gone from the church version. I made copies and hid them where hands couldn't reach easily. In the morning, I asked, casually, if anyone would check if something happened to me. Marion deflected. Serafina dismissed. They always work together. Then Deacon Rowe knocked with a folder. "Estate inventory," he said. "Finalizing the legacy transfer." I hadn't been told. That evening, the church office emailed the record. Page 1, equal shares. Page 2, dated months later. Serafina only. My name removed cleanly, like it had never been there. I laid the pages side by side and waited for fear to arrive. It didn't. What came instead was clarity. That night, the gas hiss returned, softer. I turned it off and didn't call anyone. On my bedroom carpet, a matchbox appeared by my door. No logo, no dust. Evidence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits to see if you're ready to look. I was. And as dawn crept in, I understood this wasn't about memory anymore. It was about timing, and someone had already started the clock. The next morning, the house moved like nothing had changed. Marion hummed while slicing fruit. Serafina scrolled through her phone, thumb flicking upward, collecting validation in silence. No one mentioned the gas. No one mentioned the matchbox. That was how this family worked. Danger didn't exist unless it could be controlled, repackaged, or blamed on someone else. I took my coffee to the back porch and opened my notebook. Not the journal with feelings. The other one. Dates. Times. Observations. I wrote, gas stove turned on overnight. Alarm unplugged. No explanation offered. I didn't underline it. I didn't circle it. I just recorded it. Truth doesn't need decoration. By mid-morning, Marian announced she'd be out most of the day. Church finance meeting, she said, already reaching for her coat. That phrase had become a blanket excuse for anything that required secrecy. Serafina followed soon after, heels clicking, perfume trailing behind her like proof of importance. The house emptied, but the wait stayed. I waited 10 minutes before moving. Marian's office was always immaculate. Files squared, pens aligned, nothing left to chance. Control likes clean lines. I didn't rush. I checked the door frame first, the way you do once you learn to look for things that shouldn't be there. No tape, no scratches. I stepped inside and shut the door, quietly. The locked drawer yielded the same way it had before. Inside were folders I hadn't fully examined the first time. Bank statements, trust summaries, insurance riders. I took photos of everything, careful to capture timestamps and account numbers. One document stopped me cold. An addendum, accident rider, early activation clause. I read it twice, then a third time. The policy didn't just exist. It had conditions. Conditions that triggered benefits faster if the insured was incapacitated within the family residence. My name was printed cleanly at the top. Marian sat neatly under beneficiary. There was a digital signature attributed to me, dated 3 days after my last birthday. I'd been at work that day. I had receipts. I had location data. I hadn't signed anything. I photographed the signature page, zoomed in, captured the metadata. Then I put everything back exactly as I found it. When control people sense disruption, they close ranks. I wasn't ready for that yet. That afternoon, Deacon Rowe called. His voice was gentle, practiced. Just checking in, he said. Your mother mentioned you might help with some inventory questions. I wasn't aware of any transfer, I replied evenly. A pause. Oh, well, I'm sure it's nothing formal yet. Nothing formal yet. That was the tell. I hung up and opened the church email he'd sent earlier. I forwarded it to myself and archived the original. Then I printed both versions of the legacy document, the original equal share and the revised single name version, and slid them into a folder I labeled Foundation. That evening, Marian returned with groceries and warmth dialed up too high. She touched my shoulder in passing, asked if I'd eaten, offered dessert. I declined everything. When someone who withholds affection suddenly pours it on, it isn't kindness. It's recalibration. At dinner, Serafina talked about a photo shoot for St. Alden's holiday campaign. They want authenticity this year, she said, laughing. Real family values. Marian nodded. We embody that. I watched their reflections in the glass cabinet. 2 women, perfectly aligned. I wondered how long they'd rehearsed being the only story. After dishes, Marian lingered. You've been quiet, she said lightly. Everything okay? Yes, I said. I'm paying attention. Her smile tightened. That's good. Awareness is growth. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay still and listened. At 2:17 a.m., footsteps paused outside my door. A whisper followed. Low. Familiar. She's asking questions. Another voice answered. She always does. It never matters. I waited until the hall went quiet again, then sat up and wrote the time down. Not fear. Documentation. The next day, I drove to see Evelyn Crow. Evelyn had been part of my life for as long as I could remember. She'd known my father, Thomas Vaughan, before Marian ever polished his name into something marketable. Her house smelled like peppermint tea and old books, and she opened the door before I knocked. I was wondering when you'd come, she said, stepping aside. She didn't ask why. She never did. We sat at her small kitchen table, sunlight stretching across worn wood. I told her everything. The photos, the policies, the gas, the transfer. I didn't embellish. I didn't rush. When I finished, she nodded once, then stood and went to a hall closet. There's something he left, she said quietly. She returned with a yellowed envelope, edges soft with age. My name was written at the top in my father's handwriting. If you're reading this, the letter began, it means I didn't stop her in time. My throat tightened, but I kept reading. He wrote about Marian's need for control, about how fear made her rewrite reality, about how she erased what didn't fit the picture she needed the world to see. You were never the spare, he wrote. You were the balance, the one who saw everything and stayed kind anyway. If she tries to define your future, remember this, your name matters. Use it. I folded the letter carefully and held it like something fragile and solid at the same time. There's more, Evelyn said, voice rough. She handed me a newspaper, clipping sealed in plastic. The headline was old, local, easy to miss. A teenager injured in a domestic incident. No charges filed. The name beneath the photo was unfamiliar, but the pattern wasn't. She said it was an accident, Evelyn said, but I never believed that. I left Evelyn's house with the letter tucked deep in my bag and a new understanding settling into place. This wasn't about favoritism. It was about precedent. Back home, I searched archives until my eyes burned. Old reports, shelters, court dockets. Eventually, a name surfaced again, Kayla Mercer. A record at Riverside Haven, years old, incomplete. I called. The woman who answered didn't say much. He doesn't talk, she said, but he left something in case you called. What kind of something? A message. He said to tell you this. Your fire isn't new. I sat in my car long after the call ended, hands steady on the wheel. That night, I uploaded everything to a private server I'd set up weeks earlier. Photos, documents, audio, scans. I labeled the folder Truth, Burns Clean. Then I wrote a single line beneath it. If anything happens to me, this goes public. The next morning, Marian offered a weekend getaway. Just us, she said brightly. A reset. I met her eyes and nodded, because now I knew something she didn't. She thought I was still quiet. She didn't realize I was already prepared. The drive to Pine Hollow Retreat took longer than Marian said it would. The road narrowed, cell signal faded, and the trees pressed closer together the farther we went, their branches knitting overhead like they were closing a door behind us. Marian drove with both hands on the wheel, posture perfect. Humming to the radio like this was a gift she'd planned out of love instead of timing. You've been carrying so much stress, she said without looking at me. I just want you to rest. Rest. The word sat between us like a prop. When we pulled up, there was no sign, no reception desk, no welcome board with a seasonal quote. Just a single cabin, new wood, expensive lines, carefully staged simplicity. Marian unlocked the door with a key she already had. Inside, everything was symmetrical. Candles placed at exact intervals. A white robe folded at the foot of the bed. A small camera on a tripod near the dresser, angled casually as if it belonged there. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd miss it. I need to make a call, Marian said, already moving toward the porch. Unpack. Breathe. The door clicked shut behind her. I didn't rush. I checked the bathroom first. Under the sink sat a bottle labeled ethanol. In the cabinet, a box of waterproof matches. I looked up at the ceiling vent and caught the faint reflection of glass, a pinprick lens. This wasn't a retreat. It was a stage. At dinner, Marian played her part beautifully. She poured wine, asked soft questions, spoke about peace like it was something she could hand out if I behaved. My recorder sat hidden in my bag, already running. I just want us aligned again, she said, cutting her vegetables with delicate precision. Before you leave for school. Before life pulls you away. Do you want me gone? I asked gently as if curious. She laughed, quick and dismissive. I want harmony. Harmony. Another word that meant silence. That night, after Marian went to shower, I moved quickly. I unscrewed candle lids and replaced oils with tap water. I swapped the ethanol with diluted rubbing alcohol, dyed to look identical. Then I placed a decoy notebook on the nightstand, pages filled with harmless notes and dead-end contacts. Bait. At midnight, I pretended to sleep. At 4 a.m, I left. The drive back to Briarhaven felt shorter, like my mind was already miles ahead of my body. Cold air poured through the cracked window, keeping me alert. Halfway home, my phone buzzed. A voicemail from Serafina. "I don't know what you told her," she said, breathless, "but Mom's losing it. She says you're trying to destroy everything." And her voice dropped. She just bought something called an accident rider. Early activation. Early activation. When I got home, I didn't unpack. I uploaded the retreat recordings, labeled them, backed them up twice. Marion's voice was clear, calm. Before she leaves. Not concern. A deadline. By morning, the house was tense. Marion moved quietly. Serafina avoided my eyes. At 6:21 p.m. the night before, Marion had gone live on social media, crying, holding one of my jackets, talking about a terrible accident. Prayers poured in. A fundraiser launched. Flowers arrived. At 6:14 p.m., I'd been at a pharmacy across town. I had the receipt. I had footage. At breakfast, I asked calmly, "Which hospital was I in when you went live?" Marion froze, knife suspended mid-slice. "What are you talking about?" I played the live stream. Then the pharmacy video. Me in line, chatting with the cashier. Her face didn't crack. It collapsed. "You've always wanted to ruin this family," she snapped. "No," I said. "I wanted you to stop lighting fires and calling them accidents." Serafina watched from the counter, silent. That afternoon, I released the first episode of my podcast. No dramatics. No accusations. Just facts. Documents. Timelines. The line Marion never expected anyone to hear. "She's worth more if she's quiet." The response was immediate. Hundreds of listens. Then thousands. By evening, Marion's phone buzzed nonstop. Emails. Calls. A message subject line flashed across the screen when she opened it near me. Urgent investigation requested. Insurance fraud review. She didn't say a word. The church board followed by noon the next day. Temporary suspension. Ethical review. Quiet language for loud consequences. Whispers spread faster than sermons ever had. Serafina's sponsors vanished overnight. Comments flooded her pages. Screenshots stacked on top of curated perfection. She cornered me in the hallway. "You wanted this," she hissed. "You wanted me to fall." I met her stare. "I wanted you to see the ground you were standing on was me." Her mouth opened, then closed. She walked away. Messages poured in from strangers, people who recognized themselves in my silence. One said, "Thank you for burning the story before they could finish it." Late that night, as the house held its breath, my phone rang again. Unknown number. A woman's voice. "Calm. Professional. There's still a policy active in your name," she said. "And you didn't sign it. We should talk." I sat on the edge of my bed, the house finally afraid of me. Not because I was loud, but because I wasn't invisible anymore. The meeting with Irene Keller happened the next morning in a low, beige building tucked behind a row of shuttered shops on the edge of Eastmere County. Nothing about the place suggested danger or importance, which was probably why it worked. Truth rarely arrives in dramatic locations. It shows up in offices that smell like toner and burnt coffee, handed across tables by people who learned long ago how to stay calm when others panic. Irene was in her early 60s, hair cut short, blazer pressed flat. Her eyes missed nothing. "I used to work claims oversight for Crescent Mutual," she said, sliding a folder toward me. "Post-incident audits. Your name flagged 3 times in 2 weeks. That doesn't happen by accident." I opened the folder. There it was again, my name, my date of birth, my social security number. Beneficiary, Marion Vaughn. Policy status, active. Trigger clause, early activation upon incapacitation within the family residence. They amended this, Irene said. Quietly. Digitally. 3 months ago. I didn't sign it, I said. I know, she replied. The signature's a composite. Copied strokes. We've seen this before. I turned the page. My digital signature stared back at me. Clean and convincing enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking closely. They filed this 3 days after your podcast episode went live, Irene added, almost like they were racing a clock. They weren't waiting anymore. Back home, the house felt different. Not hostile, alert. Like it knew the rules had shifted. Marion stayed in her room most of the afternoon. Phone calls murmuring through the door. Serafina hovered, brittle and restless, like she was waiting for someone to tell her what to do next. I didn't confront them. I organized. I compiled everything. Bank transfers, forged medical records, insurance riders, the edited legacy documents, my father's uncut video, the retreat recordings. I sent copies to the attorney Irene recommended, Arthur Hale, and labeled the Master File Foundation. 48 hours later, Marion was served. The active policy was frozen. Estate transfers halted. A formal inquiry opened. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. That wasn't her style. But the house filled with the sound of pacing at night, footsteps crossing and recrossing the same patch of floor. Control slipping makes noise. I released another podcast episode. This one titled The Signature. I walked listeners through the facts. No speculation. No emotion. Just the mechanics of how a life can be repurposed without consent if no one thinks to check. She taught me fire was danger, I said near the end. But silence is deadlier when it's edited. The clip spread. It wasn't catchy. It was clear. Emails arrived from producers, asking for interviews, appearances, a series. I declined all of them. I didn't need cameras. I needed records to stand. At St. Alden's, Marion's suspension became official. Temporary, they said. Pending review. The kind of language institutions use when they want distance, without accountability. Whispers bloomed anyway. Someone posted, some people play with fire, then act surprised when they get burned. I walked past Marion's room one afternoon and heard her on the phone. I built this image, she hissed. They can't erase me. Built, not lived. That night, I sent one final audio file to Crescent Mutual's investigators. Marion's voice, steady and unmistakable. She's worth more if she's quiet. And if she's quiet long enough, the policy activates. I listened to it once before deleting it from my phone. Not out of mercy. Out of finality. The next morning, my school emailed. They acknowledged the falsified psychological assessment in my file. Signed by a doctor who'd been dead for 5 years. An internal review opened. An apology followed. It was the first official message I'd ever received that addressed me as something other than an accessory. Serafina unraveled faster. Sponsors dropped her. Campaigns disappeared. Her comments filled with screenshots and timelines that refused to be curated away. She cornered me by the laundry room. Eyes red, voice sharp. You wanted this, she said. You wanted to see me fall. I wanted you to see where you were standing, I replied. It was on me. She had no answer for that. The podcast crossed 500,000 listens. Messages poured in, people who had been edited out of their own families, their own histories. One line stuck with me. Thank you for telling your story before they could finish writing it. Late one night, as the house finally quieted, a voicemail arrived from an unknown number. We need to talk, a man said. It's about the policy. Your name is still attached to something you didn't authorize. Not every fire ends in ash. Some leave behind signatures. And some signatures, once exposed, don't belong to the person who tried to use them. The voicemail replayed itself in my head long after the screen went dark. We need to talk. It's about the policy. Your name is still attached to something you didn't authorize. I didn't call back immediately. I'd learned that urgency was rarely for my benefit. Instead, I wrote the number down, logged the timestamp, and added it to the growing archive I kept on an encrypted drive labeled continuity. If someone wanted my attention, they'd wait until I was ready to give it. By morning, the house felt hollowed out. Marion hadn't slept. Neither had Serafina. Control, once cracked, doesn't collapse loudly, it frays strand by strand. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd eaten in silence for years, nodding at conversations that never included me. Marion entered halfway through my second cup. Her hair was perfect. Her eyes were not. "You're enjoying this," she said, not accusing, measuring. "No," I replied. "I'm finishing it." She studied my face, searching for emotion she could use. When she didn't find it, she adjusted tactics. "You don't understand the consequences," she said. "People will talk." "They already are," I said. "They just finally have the right story." Her jaw tightened. "You're tearing apart this family." I met her gaze. "You dismantled it, quietly. I'm just making the parts visible." She left without another word. The door didn't slam. It didn't need to. An hour later, I returned the call. We met in a glass-walled conference room at a nondescript insurance office off the interstate. The man who introduced himself as Daniel Rowe looked ordinary. Mid-50s, gray at the temples, voice careful. He didn't sit until I did. "I worked compliance for Crescent Mutual," he said, "before Irene Keller. I reviewed historical rider clauses." He slid a thin folder across the table. "Your mother didn't just take out one policy," he said. "She layered them." I opened the folder. Policy 1, accident coverage. Policy 2, incapacitation rider. Policy 3, supplemental beneficiary clause tied to estate holdings. All under my name. All filed at different times, Daniel continued. All justified as family planning. Individually, they're questionable. Together, they form intent. I felt something settle in my chest, not fear, not anger. Clarity. "She planned redundancy," I said. "Yes," he replied, "in case one failed." "And they're still active." "One is frozen. 2 are under review. The third," he paused. "The third was quietly transferred." "To whom?" Daniel hesitated. "A shell trust, established last year. Beneficiary listed as Serafina Vaughn." I closed the folder slowly. "So even if I disappeared," I said, "she wouldn't get the money." "No," he confirmed. "Your sister would." I sat back, breath steady. That explained Serafina's silence. Her fear wasn't guilt, it was exposure. Daniel leaned forward. "You need to understand something. This isn't just civil anymore. This is criminal, but only if you're willing to press." "I am," I said, carefully. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed with a friend across town. Someone Marion never bothered to remember existed. From the guest room, I logged into my server and began organizing everything into 3 distinct timelines. Financial, medical, narrative. Lies don't survive when you stack them side by side. The next morning, Serafina called. Her voice shook. "You didn't have to do this." "I didn't," I said. "I chose to." "You're ruining everything." "No," I corrected. "I'm returning it to its original condition." Silence. Then, softer. She said, "You'd never fight back." "That's why this worked for so long," I said. She hung up without saying goodbye. Within days, official letters arrived. Crescent Mutual escalated the case. The trust was frozen, pending investigation. Marion was notified. Her response came in the form of a handwritten note slipped under the door of the house I hadn't returned to. "You were always too sensitive for this world," it read. "I was protecting you." I photographed it, archived it, and threw the original away. Protection doesn't require forgery. The formal hearing was scheduled for the following week. Administrative, not dramatic. A panel, documents, recorded statements. Marion arrived composed, dressed for church, smile calibrated. Serafina sat behind her, hands folded, eyes hollow. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't tell my story. I showed it. I played the unedited recording of Marion discussing policy activation. I presented the layered insurance documents. I submitted Daniel Rowe's compliance memo. I submitted Irene Keller's forensic signature analysis. The room didn't gasp. It went quiet. The kind of quiet that means no one can pretend anymore. Marion didn't look at me as the panel adjourned. Serafina did. For a moment, her face looked young. Lost. The decision came 2 days later. All policies voided. Trust dissolved. Case referred to the district attorney for review of insurance, fraud, and identity misuse. I moved out the same afternoon. Not dramatically. Just boxes, labeled clearly, stacked neatly. I left nothing behind that could be rewritten. My new place was small, clean, anonymous. The first night there, I slept without listening for footsteps. The podcast episode that followed wasn't angry. It was brief. Some families don't raise children, I said. They curate them. And sometimes the only way to survive is to step out of the frame entirely. Messages poured in. Support. Stories. Proof that silence had siblings everywhere. I didn't respond to most of them. I didn't need witnesses anymore. I had records. And somewhere behind all of this, behind the policies, the lies, the careful cruelty, something else was moving. Something unfinished. Something Marion had tried very hard to bury. I could feel it. I didn't go back to the old house. Not once. Marion left 3 voicemails and sent 2 emails that sounded reasonable enough to confuse anyone who hadn't lived inside her version of care. I archived them all without listening twice. I'd learned that the second listen was where doubt tried to creep in. Instead, I focused on stabilizing what she destabilized. Arthur Hale, the attorney Irene had connected me with, called it containment. Not justice. Not closure. Containment. Making sure nothing else could be quietly altered while attention drifted. The district attorney's office moved slowly, as they always do. Paperwork. Jurisdiction checks. Requests for additional documentation. Marion wasn't arrested. Not yet. But the referral existed, and that alone changed the air around her. Institutions treat you differently once they've marked your name. Serafina stopped calling. I didn't reach out either. For years, I'd mistaken proximity for relationship. Now I understood distance could be its own kind of truth. 2 weeks after the hearing, Arthur forwarded me a document flagged urgent. It was a copy of a property trust deed tied to the Holloway estate. My grandfather's original holdings, the ones Marion had always claimed were too complicated to discuss. They tried to move this last year, Arthur said on the phone. Quietly. The paperwork stalled, but the intent is clear. My name was nowhere on it. Was it ever supposed to be? I asked. Yes, he replied. Originally. Before amendments. That was when it clicked. The insurance policies weren't the beginning. They were the backup plan. The real objective had always been control of the estate. Money that didn't require my disappearance, only my compliance. And when compliance failed, contingency took over. I requested the full trust history. When it arrived, the pattern was unmistakable. My name appeared in early drafts, then vanished in later versions, replaced by language that framed Serafina as sole successor and Marion as lifetime executor. Each change was justified with a phrase I recognized too well, for her own good. I laughed when I read that line, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. Marion's favorite phrase. I scheduled a meeting with Arthur, Irene, and Daniel Rowe in one room. I needed alignment before moving forward. If I'd learned anything, it was that partial truths collapse under pressure. This isn't just fraud, Irene said after reviewing the trust amendments. It's narrative conditioning. She positioned you as incapable long before the paperwork caught up. Daniel nodded, which makes the insurance angle more dangerous. If something had happened to you, the story was already written. Arthur leaned back. We can challenge the trust, but it will get ugly. I know, I said. It already did. We filed the challenge. That was the moment Marion escalated. Not publicly. Never publicly. She went after my work. A complaint landed in my HR inbox accusing me of ethical violations, conflict of interest, emotional instability, unprofessional conduct. The language was careful, concerned, designed to trigger review without accusation. I wasn't surprised. I was ready. I submitted my documentation, the forged psychological report, the timing of the insurance amendments, the recorded calls, the panel decision voiding the policies, the referral to the DA. The complaint collapsed under its own weight. HR didn't just dismiss it, they apologized. That apology mattered more than Marion would ever understand. A week later, I received a message from someone I hadn't expected. Eleanor Price. She was my aunt by marriage, my father's sister-in-law, the one Marion always described as unstable and difficult, the one who stopped coming to holidays when I was 15. Her message was short. I saw what happened. I believe you. If you want to know what she did before you, call me. We met at a quiet diner 2 towns over. Eleanor looked older than I remembered, but lighter, like someone who had finally stopped carrying something heavy. She tried it with me first, Eleanor said without preamble. Not the insurance, the erasure. She told me about the inheritance dispute after my grandfather's death, how Marion had positioned herself as mediator, then gradually rewrote family consensus until Eleanor was framed as unstable, unreliable, ungrateful. How records went missing. How stories shifted. She didn't take my money, Eleanor said. She took my credibility. Once that was gone, everything else followed. I listened. I recorded with consent. Patterns only matter if you can prove them. Before we parted, Eleanor handed me a flash drive. I kept this because I didn't know what else to do, she said. Now I do. On it were emails, drafts, early trust documents, versions Marion never meant anyone to see. The missing pieces fell into place. When Arthur added Eleanor's testimony to the trust challenge, Marion's attorney requested a delay. Then another. Stalling. The DA's office finally called me in. Not for questioning, for confirmation. They had enough to move forward. Insurance fraud, identity misuse, coercive control. Marion was notified that charges were under consideration. That night, she showed up at my door. Unannounced. Uninvited. I didn't open it. She stood in the hallway outside my apartment for a long time. I could hear her breathing through the door. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't angry. It was wounded. I gave you everything, she said. I didn't respond. I protected you, she insisted. Silence. You wouldn't have survived without me. That one I answered. You don't get to decide that, I said through the door. She left after that. I sat on the floor for a long time, back against the wall, listening to the echo fade. The trust hearing was scheduled for the following month. Marion resigned from 2 boards before she was asked to. Serafina disappeared from public view entirely, and I, quietly, deliberately, began planning a future that didn't require permission. I changed my phone number. I updated my emergency contacts. I rewrote my will, not out of fear, out of ownership, because for the first time, the story wasn't something I was defending. It was something I was authoring. And Marion, no matter how carefully she'd edited the past, had finally lost control of the ending. I measured it in documents finalized, locks changed, names removed from access lists, in small, permanent actions that didn't announce themselves but couldn't be undone. The trust hearing loomed in the background like weather. Inevitable, slow-moving, impossible to ignore. Marion hadn't contacted me again after standing outside my apartment door. That silence wasn't peace. It was recalibration. People like her don't retreat. They reframe. Arthur warned me the week before the hearing. She's going to try to make this about you, he said. Your stability. Your motives. Your credibility. She already did, I replied. She just didn't expect anyone to check. The discovery phase, was brutal in its own quiet way. Emails subpoenaed. Drafts pulled from archives Marion assumed were long gone. Each version of the trust showed the same evolution. My name present, then softened, then explained away, then removed. Always with the same language. Concerns about readiness, emotional fragility, best interests of the family. Every phrase had been spoken aloud to me at some point in my life. Seeing them weaponized in legal text didn't hurt the way I expected. It clarified. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. Not from nerves, from memory. My mind kept replaying moments I'd dismissed for years because they didn't seem dramatic enough to count as harm. The time Marion told my high school counselor I was prone to exaggeration, and suddenly my complaints about being followed home stopped being taken seriously. The time a scholarship application vanished after Marion helped review it. The time I found a journal I kept as a teenager in the trash, pages torn out carefully, selectively. She hadn't needed fire. She'd used correction fluid. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. No jury, no gallery, just a long table, neutral walls, and a judge who had seen too many families eat themselves alive over money and control. Marion arrived composed, dressed in pale blue, the color she wore when she wanted to look harmless. Serafina didn't come. That absence spoke louder than any testimony could. Arthur presented first. He didn't dramatize. He laid out the facts chronologically. Early trust drafts, amendments, language shifts, Eleanor's testimony, the insurance overlap, the psychological report signed by a dead doctor, the complaint to my employer time days after the policy freeze. Patterns don't need emotion to be convincing. Marion's attorney focused on me. She was struggling, he said, emotionally, academically. Her mother stepped in to protect the family assets. Protect. That word again. When it was my turn, I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain my feelings. I didn't ask for sympathy. I corrected the record. I submitted my academic transcripts, employment reviews, medical evaluations from independent providers. The timeline showing how concerns about my instability only appeared after I began asking questions. The judge asked Marion one question. Why was your daughter never informed of these changes? Marion smiled gently. She wouldn't have understood. The judge didn't smile back. The ruling came a week later. The trust was invalidated. Not partially, entirely. It would be rewritten under court supervision, with all original beneficiaries notified and represented independently. Marion lost executorship. She lost discretionary authority. She lost the power to edit. The DA's office filed charges 2 days after that. Insurance fraud, identity misuse, coercive control. She wasn't taken away in handcuffs. That wasn't how it happened. She was served papers at home, the same way she'd served silence for years. Afterward, the world didn't explode. It narrowed. Marion resigned from the last board she sat on. Her name disappeared from newsletters. Invitations stopped arriving. People who had once praised her judgment suddenly remembered other commitments. Reputation, it turns out, is fragile when it's built on omission. Serafina sent one message. I don't know who I am without her telling me. I read it once. I didn't reply. Some journeys aren't meant to be shared. I focused on rebuilding things Marion had touched. I changed banks, closed old accounts, ran credit reports I should have checked years ago. I found small discrepancies, fees, transfers, signatures that weren't mine. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal on its own. Just enough to confirm what I already knew. Control leaves fingerprints everywhere. One afternoon, Eleanor came by with coffee and a box of photographs she'd rescued years earlier. These were never meant to be framed, she said. That's why she hid them. Pictures of me as a child, laughing, messy, unposed, existing without performance. I took them home and placed one on my desk. It felt grounding in a way I hadn't expected. The podcast audience began to change. Less shock, more recognition. People didn't message to say, "I can't believe this happened to you" anymore. They said, "This happened to me too." I recorded one more episode. "I thought being erased meant disappearing," I said. "But it turns out it means being edited. And edits can be reversed if you still have the original draft." I didn't mention Marion by name. I didn't need to. The court dates stretched out. Delays. Motions. Negotiations. Marion's attorney attempted a plea deal. The DA didn't accept the first offer. I wasn't asked what I wanted. That mattered more than being asked. Because for once, the process wasn't built around my compliance. It was built around accountability. The night before Marion's arraignment, I slept soundly. No dreams. No rehearsals. Just rest. In the morning, I walked to work, stopped for coffee, greeted the barista who knew my name. Not because I'd been introduced, but because I showed up consistently. Stability doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. I didn't attend the arraignment. I didn't watch the news coverage when it finally ran. I didn't need to see her face framed by consequences. I was busy living in a life where my name no longer needed defending. And yet, despite all of that, I knew something was still unfinished. Because Marion had lost power, not perspective. People like her don't change because they're exposed. They change tactics. And somewhere in a file or a memory or a contingency she hadn't used yet, there was still one loose thread. I could feel it. Not fear. Instinct. The kind that forms when you finally trust your own perception. The first sign came disguised as courtesy. An envelope arrived at my office, not my apartment. Cream paper. Neutral font. No return address. Just my name typed cleanly across the front, as if pulled from a directory rather than memory. Inside was a single page and a USB drive taped neatly to the corner. The note read, "You deserve to know everything. A friend." I didn't plug the drive in immediately. I photographed it, logged the delivery time, and handed it to Arthur before curiosity could outrun caution. He had it scanned in a sandbox environment by the end of the day. What it contained wasn't explosive. It was worse. Emails, calendar invites, draft letters never sent, and a document labeled Contingency Planning, Family Assets. Arthur called me into his office the next morning. "She was planning for you to contest the trust," he said, tapping the folder. "Years ago." I sat down slowly. The document outlined steps to be taken if I ever became uncooperative. Not violent steps. Not dramatic ones. Administrative. Narrative. Reputational. Each item paired with a justification and a suggested timeline. Medical concern escalation. Employment destabilization. Legal credibility erosion. Emergency guardianship petition. "I was 18 when she wrote this," I said. Arthur nodded. "Which means this wasn't reactive. It was strategic." I didn't feel shock. Shock requires surprise. What I felt was confirmation. Heavy, steady, clarifying. We traced the metadata. The file originated from a private server Marion had access to through a former board affiliation. The edits spanned years. Some steps had already been executed. Others, marked if needed, had never been used. One line stood out. "Final measure requires third-party corroboration." "Who?" I asked. Arthur didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. 2 days later, I found out. Her name was Lydia Moore, and she had been my therapist, briefly, when I was 19. I remembered Lydia as calm, distant, professional. I'd only seen her a handful of times before Marion decided it wasn't a good fit. At the time, I'd assumed it was about insurance coverage. Arthur subpoenaed Lydia's records. What came back was incomplete. Session notes existed for Serafina. For Marion. For me, only intake forms. No progress notes. No treatment summaries. No discharge documentation. But there was a letter, dated 6 months after our last session, addressed to Marion. "Your concerns are valid," it read. Based on observed behaviors, continued independence may pose emotional risk. I stared at the page for a long time. I never said those things, I said quietly. Arthur nodded. She did. We brought it to the DA. This time they didn't slow down. Lydia Moore was interviewed, then interviewed again, then suspended pending review. Her license came under scrutiny, not just for my case for patterns. She confessed within a week. Marion had approached her as a worried mother, provided context, suggested language, framed concerns. Lydia hadn't falsified records outright. She'd written what she was led to believe, which legally was still falsification. When the news broke, quietly, professional bulletins, licensing board notices, I felt something loosen inside my chest. Not relief. Release. One more thread accounted for. Marion's arraignment date moved up. She didn't contact me. She contacted Eleanor. Eleanor called me immediately. She wants to apologize, Eleanor said flatly. Publicly. Strategically. No, I replied. She wants to reposition. Exactly. Marion's attorney released a statement that afternoon. My client acknowledges mistakes made out of fear and maternal concern. She is committed to healing and reconciliation. Fear, concern, healing. The same words, rearranged. The DA responded within hours. The charges reflect a pattern of intentional misconduct over multiple years involving identity misuse and financial fraud. That ended the narrative contest. Still, Marion had one move left. She tried to settle, not with me, with the estate. An offer was made to redistribute assets fairly, provided all parties agreed to confidentiality. No admission of wrongdoing. No testimony. No trial. Arthur brought it to me with raised eyebrows. You don't have to decide today, he said. I read the offer carefully. Money has a way of revealing intent. This wasn't compensation. It was insulation. If I agree, I said, she keeps her version intact. Yes. And if I don't? She risks everything. I didn't need time. No, I said. Arthur smiled once. Briefly. The trial date was set. Leading up to it, I prepared in ways I never had before. Not emotionally. Logistically. I reviewed timelines. Practiced testimony. Read my own words until they stopped feeling like confessions and started feeling like facts. I wasn't nervous. I was precise. Marion avoided the courtroom on the first day. Procedural delay. Illness. The second day, she arrived early. She didn't look at me. I didn't look away. The prosecution laid out the case methodically. Insurance layers. Trust manipulation. Third-party corroboration. The contingency document. Lydia Moore's statement. The defense tried to frame intent as overprotection. That strategy collapsed under documentation. When Marion took the stand, her voice was calm, controlled, familiar. I was afraid, she said. I did what I thought was best. For whom? The prosecutor asked. A pause. For my family. I was called next. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I explained. I explained what it feels like to realize your life has been planned around your compliance. To discover that your independence was never a goal, only a variable to manage. I wasn't fragile, I said. I was inconvenient. The room stayed silent. That silence was different from the ones I'd grown up in. This one belonged to everyone. The verdict didn't come immediately. Deliberation takes time. But the outcome was clear long before it was announced. Guilty on multiple counts. Sentencing scheduled. Marion's shoulders slumped, not in grief, but in recognition. The recognition that the story was no longer hers to tell. I didn't stay for sentencing. I walked out into the afternoon light and breathed. Not deeply, just freely. In the weeks that followed, life didn't transform overnight. It stabilized. I returned to routines. Work. Evenings. Sleep that didn't require vigilance. The podcast audience plateaued. I didn't mind. Viral attention is a season. Truth is a climate. One final envelope arrived, forwarded from Arthur. Inside was a copy of the contingency document, marked closed with a handwritten note attached. She always underestimated you. I folded it once and filed it away. Not as evidence. As a reminder. No court dates circled in red. No new filings landing in my inbox. No carefully worded statements pretending concern while hiding control. The machinery that had once moved quietly around me, planning, editing, preparing, had shut down, not because it chose to, but because it had been exposed to light it couldn't survive. Marion was sentenced on a gray morning I didn't attend. I read the outcome later, standing in line for coffee, the barista calling my name with casual familiarity. Probation. Financial restitution. A permanent bar from holding fiduciary authority. Mandatory oversight. No dramatic punishment, no spectacle. Just consequences that followed her everywhere. Quietly, the way her influence once followed me. It felt fitting. People often ask what justice feels like. They expect relief, triumph, something sharp and immediate. What I felt instead was space. Mental, emotional, physical space. The kind that lets you breathe without checking who's listening. Serafina didn't come to sentencing either. I heard through Eleanor that she'd moved across the country, changed her last name professionally, stepped away from anything that tied her to the image Marion had built. I didn't reach out. I didn't need to. Some relationships don't end in conversation. They end in clarity. The trust was rebuilt under court supervision. I was named as an equal beneficiary, transparently, formally with independent counsel assigned to every party. No discretion. No soft language. Just structure. I accepted my portion without ceremony and placed most of it in accounts Marion would never touch. Not because I was afraid, but because boundaries are easier to maintain when they're boring. I stopped recording the podcast. Not because I had nothing left to say, but because I no longer needed a public record to exist safely. I left the episodes up, archived, unedited. People still found them. Messages still arrived. I read some. I answered a few. Mostly I lived. Living turned out to be quieter than survival. I moved again, not out of fear, but choice. A smaller place, closer to work, filled with light instead of vigilance. I framed one photograph from Eleanor's box. Me at 8 years old, missing teeth, laughing at something outside the frame. No performance. No audience. Just proof I'd always existed. Sometimes, in the evenings, I caught myself waiting for interruption. For correction. For someone to tell me I was doing something wrong, simply by doing it independently. The habit faded slowly. Conditioning always does. Arthur called one last time to close the file. "It's done," he said. "All of it." "Thank you," I replied. He paused. "You know, most people don't make it this far." "I know," I said. "That's why I didn't rush." Eleanor and I kept in touch. She told me stories about my father I'd never heard. Small things Marion never found important enough to pass on. How he laughed too loud. How he hated early mornings. How he once told Eleanor he worried I'd disappear if no one protected my quiet. He hadn't known that quiet wasn't absence. It was observation. On the 1-year anniversary of the verdict, I took a day off work and went nowhere special. I walked. I ate lunch alone. I wrote in a notebook without labeling it evidence. I didn't mark the date. That felt important. Late that evening, a message arrived from an unknown number. My chest tightened instinctively before I opened it. It was short. "I see you now. I'm sorry it took losing everything. Marion." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I archived it. Not out of cruelty. Out of completion. Closure isn't something someone gives you after they've finished hurting you. It's something you claim the moment you stop arranging your life around their perception. Forgiveness may come later, or it may not. Either way, it's optional. Safety isn't. I went to bed that night without checking locks twice. Without rehearsing conversations. without scanning for contingencies. The story that once tried to erase me no longer required defense, documentation, or narration. It simply ended. And the life that followed didn't need an audience, a title, or a warning. It only needed one thing I finally had: ownership. If my story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Support the channel by subscribing and share in the comments where you're watching from. Every interaction helps stories like this reach people who need to hear that silence isn't strength and reclaiming your life is always possible.